The phone call came at 3 a.m. from someone McGregor never expected to hear from again. A former UFC executive with a shocking revelation. Dana White was planning to destroy McGregor's career, and the only way to stop him was to take control of the UFC itself. Welcome back to Fight Night Secrets, where we expose the most explosive stories from inside the world's biggest fighting organization. Tonight, we're diving into the ultimate power struggle that nearly tore the UFC apart from within. A story of corporate warfare, betrayal at the highest levels, and a battle for control that had nothing to do with what happened inside the octagon. This is the untold story of how Conor McGregor tried to overthrow Dana White and seize control of the UFC empire. The seeds of this war were planted in late 2022, when McGregor was at the peak of his earning power, but increasingly frustrated with his position within the UFC hierarchy. Despite being the company's biggest draw and highest-paid fighter, he felt that Dana White treated him as an employee rather than a partner. The breaking point came during contract negotiations for what would become McGregor's biggest payday ever, a trilogy fight with Nate Diaz that was projected to generate over 3 million pay-per-view buys. McGregor wanted not just fighter pay, but a percentage of the company's overall revenue from the event. "I'm not just a fighter anymore, Dana," McGregor said during a heated meeting at UFC headquarters. "I'm the reason this company is worth billions. I want to be treated like a partner, not a performer." Dana White's response was characteristically blunt. "Conor, you're the best fighter we've ever had, but you're still just a fighter. The UFC existed before you got here, and it'll exist long after you're gone." That meeting ended with McGregor storming out, but more importantly, it planted an idea in his mind that would eventually grow into something much more dangerous for Dana White's control of the company. McGregor began quietly reaching out to former UFC executives who had left the company over the years, many of whom had their own grievances against Dana White's management style. The most important of these contacts was Marcus Chen, former UFC Senior Vice President of Business Development, who had been forced out in 2021 after challenging some of White's strategic decisions. "Conor, Dana runs the UFC like his personal kingdom," Chen explained during a secret meeting at McGregor's Dublin mansion. But here's what most people don't know. The actual ownership structure is more complicated than it appears. Chen revealed that while Endeavor Group owned the majority stake in the UFC, there were several smaller investment groups that held significant minority positions. More importantly, there were provisions in the original sale agreement that could potentially be triggered to force a change in management under certain circumstances. If you could get enough of the minority shareholders on your side, plus some key sponsors and broadcast partners, you might be able to force Endeavor to replace Dana as president. The idea was audacious, but McGregor had never been one to shy away from ambitious goals. He began developing what he privately called Operation Takeover, a complex plan to build a coalition powerful enough to challenge Dana White's control. The first step was to identify the UFC's most valuable assets beyond just the fights themselves. McGregor discovered that the company's international expansion, streaming rights, and merchandising deals were all areas where he had significant influence that Dana White couldn't easily replace. McGregor's global appeal had been crucial to the UFC's expansion into European and Asian markets. His whiskey brand, Proper Number 12, had exclusive partnerships with UFC that generated millions in cross-promotional revenue. Most importantly, his social media following of over 50 million gave him a direct line to the UFC's most valuable demographic. "Dana thinks he holds all the cards," McGregor told his inner circle during a planning meeting. "But he forgets that I bring more than just fighting skills to this company. I bring an entire global brand. The second phase of the operation involved secretly approaching other high-profile fighters who had their own issues with UFC management. McGregor was surprised to discover how many top fighters were frustrated with their treatment by the company. John Jones had been feuding with Dana White over pay for years. Jorge Masvidal felt that he had been unfairly passed over for title shots. Even some of the company's biggest stars, like Israel Adesanya and Francis Ngannou, had expressed private concerns about the UFC's direction under White's leadership. Chapter: We're not just employees, McGregor explained to a select group of fighters during a private gathering in Las Vegas. We're the product. Without us, the UFC is just an empty octagon and a logo. It's time we had a say in how this company is run. The most crucial element of McGregor's plan was securing financial backing from investors who could match Endeavor's resources. Through his business connections, he identified several wealthy individuals and investment groups who were interested in gaining a foothold in the rapidly growing sports entertainment industry. The lead investor was Alexander Volkov, a Russian billionaire who had made his fortune in technology and media. Volkov had been looking for opportunities to enter the American sports market, and the idea of partnering with McGregor to acquire a stake in the UFC was extremely appealing. Mr. McGregor, your plan is ambitious but not impossible, Volkov said during a meeting on his private yacht off the coast of Monaco. I can provide the financial resources you need, but we must be very careful about how we proceed. Dana White is not a man who will give up power easily. With financial backing secured and a coalition of fighters assembled, McGregor moved to the third phase of his plan, applying pressure through the UFC's external partnerships and relationships. He began using his influence with major sponsors to subtly suggest that their continued investment in the UFC might depend on the company's willingness to evolve its management structure. His connections in the entertainment industry allowed him to plant stories in trade publications about tensions within the UFC's leadership. Most effectively, he leveraged his relationship with streaming and broadcast partners to express concerns about the long-term sustainability of the UFC's current business model under Dana White's increasingly controversial public persona. Dana's ego is starting to hurt the brand, McGregor confided to executives at ESPN during what appeared to be a casual dinner meeting. Fans are getting tired of his act, and international markets are becoming resistant to his approach. The UFC needs leadership that can grow with the sport. For months, this pressure campaign operated beneath the surface of the UFC's public operations. Dana White was aware that something was happening. He could sense the subtle shifts in how sponsors, media partners, and even some fighters were interacting with him. But he couldn't identify the source. The breakthrough moment came when Jennifer Martinez, a former UFC marketing executive who had remained loyal to Dana White, discovered the extent of McGregor's operation through her network of contacts in the industry. "Dana, you need to know what's really going on," she told him during an urgent late-night phone call. "Conor isn't just complaining about his contract. He's trying to take over the entire company." Martinez had uncovered details about the investor meetings, the fighter coalition, and most damaging of all, recordings of conversations where McGregor explicitly discussed his plans to force Dana White out of his position. Dana White's reaction was swift and decisive. Instead of confronting McGregor directly, he chose to use his own network of power and influence to turn the tables on the conspiracy against him. White's first move was to reach out to Ari Emanuel, CEO of Endeavor Group and the UFC's ultimate boss. Emanuel had built his career on navigating complex power struggles in Hollywood and was not easily intimidated by ambitious challenges to his authority. "Ari, We have a situation with McGregor that goes way beyond normal contract negotiations, White explained during an emergency meeting at Endeavor's Beverly Hills headquarters. He's trying to stage a corporate coup. Emmanuel's response was characteristically direct. Then let's remind him who actually runs this company. Within 48 hours, Endeavor had mobilized its full resources to counter McGregor's operation. Legal teams began scrutinizing every aspect of McGregor's existing contracts with the UFC, looking for provisions that could be used to limit his influence or terminate his relationship with the company entirely. More importantly, Emmanuel used his extensive connections in the entertainment and sports industries to apply counterpressure on the same sponsors, media partners, and investors that McGregor had been courting. Conor McGregor is a talented fighter, Emmanuel told key stakeholders, but he's also a loose cannon who doesn't understand the complexities of running a multi-billion-dollar entertainment company. Supporting his power grab would be a serious mistake. The tide began to turn when several of McGregor's key allies started receiving offers they couldn't refuse to distance themselves from the takeover attempt. Alexander Volkov was quietly informed that his other business interests in the United States might face regulatory scrutiny if he continued to pursue his UFC investment. Marcus Chen, the former UFC executive who had been advising McGregor, was offered a lucrative consulting contract with Endeavor in exchange for providing inside information about the conspiracy's operations. Even some of the fighters who had initially supported McGregor began to reconsider when they realized that the UFC could make their professional lives very difficult if the takeover attempt failed. The final blow came when Dana White decided to go public with the conflict, but in a way that made McGregor appear to be the aggressor rather than a legitimate challenger to poor management. During a press conference ostensibly about upcoming UFC events, White casually mentioned that certain fighters had been overreaching and trying to involve themselves in business decisions that were way above their pay grade. "Look, we love our fighters, but there's a reason why fighters fight and businessmen run businesses," White said with his characteristic smirk. "Some people think that being good at punching people in the face makes them qualified to run a corporation. It doesn't." The comment was clearly directed at McGregor, and it had the intended effect of making him appear arrogant and overambitious to both the media and the general public. McGregor's response was to demand a face-to-face meeting with Dana White to resolve the conflict once and for all. What he didn't know was that White had been hoping for exactly this opportunity to end the power struggle definitively. The meeting took place in a private conference room at UFC headquarters, with only McGregor, White, and Ari Emanuel present. McGregor came prepared with documents, financial projections, and a detailed presentation about why the UFC needed new leadership. White let him talk for 20 minutes before responding with a single devastating revelation. "Conor, everything you've told me today, I already knew about weeks ago. Marcus Chen has been reporting your every move back to us since the beginning. Your investor meetings, your fighter recruitment, your sponsor pressure campaigns. We've been watching all of it." McGregor's face went white as he realized the extent of the betrayal. "Marcus has been working for you this whole time?" "Marcus Chen was never really fired from the UFC, Emmanuel explained. "We put him in deep cover specifically to identify potential internal threats to our operations. When he told us about your approach, we saw it as the perfect opportunity to let you reveal the full extent of your ambitions." The trap had been perfect. By allowing McGregor to develop his takeover plans while secretly monitoring every aspect of the operation, White and Emanuel had not only neutralized the threat, but also gathered evidence that could be used to justify taking action against McGregor. "Here's what's going to happen," White continued. You're going to publicly apologize for overstepping your bounds as a fighter. You're going to recommit to your existing contract with no additional demands. And you're going to cease all contact with outside investors interested in the UFC. And if I refuse? Emmanuel answered that question. If you refuse, we'll release recordings of your meetings where you explicitly discuss undermining the UFC's management. We'll show that you've been working with foreign investors to destabilize an American entertainment company. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your existing contracts will be terminated for breach of fiduciary duty, and you'll never fight in the UFC again. McGregor realized he had been completely outmaneuvered. His grand plan to seize control of the UFC had not only failed, but it had also put him in a position where his entire career could be destroyed. "Dana, this doesn't have to end our relationship," McGregor said, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his ambitions. "I can still be valuable to the UFC." White's response was cold, but not entirely unsympathetic. "Conor, you're one of the greatest fighters who ever lived, and you've made both of us a lot of money. But you need to understand something very clearly. I didn't build this company to hand it over to someone else, no matter how talented they are. The UFC will always have a place for Conor McGregor, the fighter. But Conor McGregor, the corporate raider? That guy needs to disappear permanently." In the end, McGregor had no choice but to accept White's terms. He publicly apologized for miscommunications with UFC management and recommitted to focusing on his fighting career rather than business operations. The failed takeover attempt actually strengthened Dana White's position within the UFC and Endeavor. He had demonstrated that he could effectively neutralize even the most sophisticated challenges to his authority, which made other potential rivals think twice about similar attempts. McGregor returned to fighting with a new understanding of the limits of his power within the UFC hierarchy. While he remained one of the company's biggest stars, he never again attempted to challenge the fundamental structure of the organization. The war for control of the UFC was over before most people even knew it had begun. Dana White had proven once again that in the fight business, the most important battles are often fought in boardrooms rather than octagons. And sometimes, the most decisive victories are the ones that never make it onto pay-per-view.